Thanks to everybody for coming. This is the Battle of Homestead Foundation that is putting on this event. I had a great event at the Whitewell Bookstore last night. Anybody get there? Anybody get there? Well, support your local bookstores because they're the people that really help spread a lot of important stories in history. Just briefly, preserving and interpreting a people's history. It's kind of down here in the fine print. That's what the Battle of Homestead Foundation does. It's been doing it for about 30 years. Right now we're in a fundraising effort to build what we call a Center for the History and Future of Work, which basically takes all these stories for the last century or so of working people in Western Pennsylvania. And the idea is to have a place where they are year-round, 365 days, 366 during leap year. They're being told to people. And I would say almost everybody involved in the Battle of Homestead Foundation as a member is part of that story, and probably everybody here is too. So the idea really is to just keep telling these stories. When someone has a great film, a great book, that's what we do to try and get them to the public. Today we have two authors with a very timely book, and a lot of it, the research occurred here in Pittsburgh. One of the researchees, I think, one of the interviewees is Bill Young, and he is going to introduce our authors. So thanks very much for coming today. We have a membership list. You can sign up. Let us know how you got here. Probably most people came through Eventbrite at some point.
Yes.
Well, we put a lot of our events on that, and like I say, mostly they're free. We do appreciate the donations that you can always make through Eventbrite. But yeah, just definitely keep in touch. You can sign up for our newsletter. It costs nothing. And that way we'll get you the word about events like this. So, Bill Young.
Hello. Can you hear me? I'm Bill Young. I'm a longtime member of the Battle of Homestead Foundation, Pennsylvania Labor History Society, and a longer time member of Insulators Local 2. And I'm very happy to introduce you to the authors of Rust Belt Blues. Lainey Newman hails from Squirrel Hill. Her senior thesis at Harvard College centered on the changing political views of union members. She is a Juris Doctor candidate at Harvard Law and now an author. Professor Theda Skocpol is a distinguished professor of government and sociology at Harvard, the author and co-author of many books, and has an incredible list of awards and accomplishments. So this is sort of a dynamic duo, a very elegant dynamic duo. And you're wondering why I'm here. I'll tell you. When I began work in the building trades in 1969, nearly everyone voted Democrat. Today, that's not true. I was the editor of my local's newsletter for 30 years, a moderator for my International Union's Facebook page for 4 years, and I've been confounded by the union members voting against their own best interest. Perhaps worse, politics have slashed into the bonds that once held us together. So when Lainey came to the house and said she was interviewing union members for the research that led to this book, I was happy as a dog on a cheeseburger. Somebody beyond cranky newsletter editors and union leaders was looking for questions and answers. There are many problems, and Rust Belt Union Blues explores them all, and rather than turning entirely to outside pundits and experts, the authors went to front lines where work boots hit the ground. They find community involvement and fellowship were critical to unity, and much was lost with the decline of industry. Our late friend George Pinky was a Pennsylvania labor history member, a labor historian, and a Bethlehem steelworker. He told us how his local union hall had been, not just for offices and meetings, but as a place for weddings and celebrations. Following the collapse of steel, his union hall building was closed, and George and a few others were meeting in a church basement. He passed away a few years ago. Solidarity and political loyalty obviously suffered. The building trades have similar problems for different reasons because their jobs are temporary and scattered widely. In the local that I worked out of, we covered all of Western Pennsylvania and parts of 3 other states. and our members' homes are scattered throughout that areas, or through those areas. So carpools and working class bars after work were our meeting places. We talked about sports, jobs, our kids, and so forth. Excuse me. Now that happens less, partly because of the heavier DUI penalties that shorten happy hour, but also because the trades have growing political divisions. I was at lunch with an old buddy who just retired last Tuesday, and he told me that the arguments sometimes approach violence. The break between Labor and Democrats can't be fixed unless we understand how and where it broke and how we might fix it. Authors Scotchpole and Newman are here to discuss those issues in their book, and the book discusses the damage and loss in communities but covers related problems as well. So we will let the authors get on with their introduction and talk about their book, and then we'll have a few general questions and open it up to question and answers. You okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Bill, for that lovely introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Lainey Newman. I'm really happy to be here with all of you. I'm sure I have a lot to learn from all of you, and I hope that we can have a conversation a little bit later in the session. We're going to start by just talking a little bit about how the project got started and introduce the project as a whole. And in doing that, we're going to start with a couple quotes that Theda will read.
These are from some of Lainey's wonderful interviews. Back in my day, you couldn't find a single union guy who would vote Republican, declared Herman, an 80-year-old retired steelworker living in Charleroi in western Pennsylvania. Another one laughed as he recalled the looming threat of getting your fingers smashed in if you drove a foreign-made truck to the mill from your nearby home, or if you were known to have voted for a Republican. So that was then, back in the heyday of steel, of manufacturing, mining, the reign of the United Steelworkers and other major industrial and trades unions here, particularly here in western Pennsylvania, but across the Rust Belt, including southern Michigan, where I grew up, south of Detroit, where the dominant unions were more likely to be auto workers and chemical workers in my hometown of Wyandotte, Michigan. But we've come a long ways because now we know that even still unionized industrial workers and the steel workers and many other major industries, and there are many fewer than they used to be, are likely to support Republicans or Donald Trump in particular. And so the mystery that we tried to solve, or initially Lainey in this book, was to try to understand how and why that transformation happened. And let me just say a couple things. We can elaborate on these because I'm sure they'll come up in the discussion. We don't question that the big internationally driven economic transformations throughout the Rust Belt that the parties both abetted in various ways, or at least didn't stop, are part of it because they led to the loss of members and dues and just some of the basic ingredients that go into political power. We also don't question that outlooks are important, but we do question that these are sufficient, and then particularly that an argument that's fashionable among many academics at a university like Harvard, that it's all racism, that can possibly be the explanation. It cannot be, because we're mainly dealing with white people then and now at the core of these industries, whose attitudes have probably become more accepting, not less, in the many decades that have passed. So just to quickly set the themes, we lay out an idea about the union man identity, in quotes. They were mostly men, but not all men. What ingredients go into that? And then we talk about the ways in which that identity and voting for Democrats as part of that identity, as well as supporting one's brothers and sisters in the union, was grounded in local community life beyond the workplace, not just in the workplace. And that we talk about the way the union was part of the fabric of family life, community life, ties to ethnic associations, churches, recreational activities. And our argument differs from what some other academics at least have put forward, in that we think that grounding was part of what made it taken for granted that Democrats were on our side and we would vote with them, rather than just getting orders from union bosses in an office, or hearing from ads at election time.
Yeah. So to continue off of what Theda said, I started this research when I was an undergraduate at Harvard. I am from Pittsburgh, from Squirrel Hill, and I had members of my family who were members of the United Auto Workers up in Minneapolis, in St. Paul region, actually. And I had always sort of understood this identity of the union man, which I think actually a lot of people have a sense of, what that means or what it sort of invokes, even today. And had seen them as, union men of their time, and they were loyal Democrats. And then in 2016, I was graduating high school, and I was working a little bit volunteering on the Hillary campaign, and we went out to Westmoreland County and did some field work out there, just knocking on doors and whatnot. And then we saw how Pennsylvania turned red that election. And so coming to college, I was really interested in understanding political changes and evolution, and have always been interested in unions and labor, and sort of combined those two interests, rooted here in Western Pennsylvania with this research project that Theda was fortunately willing to advise as a senior. And then we continued that for a year after my senior year of college, and expanded the research, did more archival work. I looked through a lot of newsletters, and we sort of tried to understand more systematically how people were talking about unions, how local unions, what types of events local unions were having, the differences between representation in union newsletters over time. So we really extended the research both by interviews and by archival and ethnographic work during that year that we worked on it together.
Yeah, and I tried to bring into it some of the work that I've done, much of it here in Pennsylvania, on the various networks that became highly active during the Tea Party period with the resistance against Obama's presidency, and then again 8 years later when Donald Trump was elected and just as much shocked the other side of the spectrum. I did quite a bit of research that talking with the various, mainly older women who formed the resistance groups in every county of Pennsylvania, really. And I remember very strikingly during that research, which happened in Pennsylvania and also in nearby Ohio, including very Rust Belt areas of Ohio, in Wisconsin, and in North Carolina. I remember in several locations people saying to me, Hillary never came here. Except at the last minute, they sent some young man from Brooklyn. That phrase was used separately in different parts of the country, who told us to do things here that didn't make any sense. So a major theme of our book is how Democrats have gone from being there with people to being someone who looks like they're somewhere else. And I would say the other big theme of our work is a slight disagreement with my colleague Bob Putnam, whose work Bowling Alone many of you have no doubt heard of. We don't think it's just that old ties have dissolved or weakened. We also think that new ties have formed to gun clubs and to megachurches in particular. We didn't do as much research on that aspect of it for this book because really the unions were a lot to work on, but I had done a little bit, and more is to be done. But we do think that it's not just a question of people who are unionized workers, still unionized workers, or former unionized workers not having any ties. They have new ties, and those new ties are connected in different ways into the party system and into the messages that politicians are trying to make visible. So you go from messages of us versus the bosses, the union, not the union bosses so much as the business bosses, to us versus what? Immigrants? Whether or not
Coastal
they're
elite.
the coastal elite and or those people that want to take your guns away, which I hear in all of my interviews with conservative people. Nobody can persuade anyone that that's not happening, even though it's not happening, right? So we can take comments and questions. Should we sit
So
down?
I think, Bill, were you going to do some initial questions and then we'll,
Do you
Yeah,
want us? We could just sit here and answer the questions, and he could come up and pose it.
okay.
Anything to sit down. and we get to know each
Now, you don't claim to be historians, but the book cites circumstances and attitudes going back into the 1950s. And some of the older men I worked with when I began in the late 60s were well aware of the bloody labor conflicts that happened in their lifetimes. Younger members have no such experience, and some of them don't even know about those events. So was there also a generational difference in their attitudes that came from lack of experience? Or?
Yeah, I think that we did notice a significant difference in member attitudes concerning sort of the historical awareness component of what it meant to be a union member or a union family. The older members that we spoke to sort of expressed a lot of, sort of appreciation or indebtedness or, sort of remembrance for the era that came before and the people who fought on behalf of the labor movement to advance the causes of the labor movement. Something interesting that I heard in some of my interviews was we don't need unions anymore because we have OSHA or we have different types of workplace protections, which, as you all know, were passed because of unions and because of advocacy that members of the labor movement did. And so I think that there's sort of a disconnect between understanding the role that unions have in maintaining protections for workers and in sort of the advances that previous members of the labor movement of generations past really did.
A lot of your interviewees told you that they had either remembered, if they were older, or heard from older family members or co-workers what it was like before the unions were organized. So, and that's always a powerful force in any kind of politics, is what's your kind of anchor point? What are you remembering that you either want to go back to or get away from? And so that's really changed, but was a central component of the Union Man identity. And remind us what the other two were that we found,
Yeah.
and we found these by listening.
Yeah, so we sort of constructed this central tenets of what the Union Man identity was, and it was historical awareness, mutual commitment, so the idea that someone's willing to sort of put the group and the collective over oneself, or at times, advance the group's interests when necessary. And then occupational pride was the third, and that was, a sense of dignity and pride, and just a sense of loyalty to one's craft, one's trade, and the other members and professionals who are in that particular industry or trade, whether that's steelworking, insulating, etc. And so those three: mutual commitment, the commitment to others and to the group, historical awareness, being connected to the past and to what the labor movement had achieved, and then occupational pride and being connected to the work. The three of those, it seemed like, came up in a lot of conversations, and then also when we were looking for mentions of this term union man and at the time it was mainly men, union man, in materials that we were going through, whether they were convention proceedings and a delegate talking about the union man over here is deserves this spot as a delegate to the convention, that type of thing, because yada yada yada. That it was pulling on these strands of of those three core tenets, and so that's how we sort of came up with those three different
And the
factors.
mutual commitment, I remember in some of the areas of use, it would come up as things like, if your guy got sick, you
Mhm.
picked up the slack for him. So it was, of course, on a picket line, in a big conflict, but it was in much more concrete ways that people would highlight and remember. Which I guess I think is really true in all workplaces. If there is some kind of loyalty to the group, people do that. I don't know how many Harvard professors would pick up. Like let me just cancel the class, you know? I mean, I don't think it really works out quite that way. Although maybe because of don't ask, but.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned, taking our guns away. That baloney's been going on for at least 30 years, and somehow it never gets over the hump to where people realize nobody's taking their guns away.
They never will.
It's the only president that ever passed legislation about guns like that was a Republican.
Yeah.
Well, to be fair, I mean, there are some Democrats who would like to take the AK-15s away, but my reading of the opinion polls, which are not good enough, and that's one of the themes of our work, that it's not good enough, is that a lot of people think, especially in the hands of those too young or mentally ill or have committed violence in families, that those are not appropriate weapons. And in my interviews with conservative people, they will acknowledge that nobody needs them for hunting.
Right.
Do you think that the right wing just kind of happened into this thing and then exploited it, or do you think there was some orchestration going on there?
There's a lot of orchestration. I mean, you know, the work that I did with many partners over the years for a book called Diminished Democracy, we tried to identify the very largest voluntary associations throughout American history. And of course, the NRA started after the Civil War. It was very much originally some of the kinds of militia units that were put together to make up the armies, the Union Army and the Confederate armies in the Civil War. But then it became very oriented toward hunting activities, which the unions also provided information about and had hunting clubs.
They were very into gun safety at one time.
Sure, and they had shooting clubs. I think this was a very deliberate takeover of the NRA in the 1970s by people who wanted to turn it into a very hard right political machine and teaming up with the gun manufacturers and frankly pursuing very savvy political strategies at all levels, because they didn't content themselves, the NRA and the other gun networks, with simply national lobbying or lobbying during national campaigns. They put a lot into that, but they also took over enough state government policy making to change the rules of the game, so that gun manufacturers couldn't be held liable. And some of the work that we drew on, it's very recent, by some anthropologists and sociologists have shown that right down to the level of the gun clubs where a lot of people go for recreation, particularly now that the union groups are not there providing these alternatives, people are taught the concept of the citizen protector, which is another way of talking about male strength. You're armed, you're ready. You hear this every time there's an incident. You hear that if only there's been a good man with a gun, you've been there. Yeah, sure. That would have solved the problem, right? But that idea is put out there, and of course, what it means is that people aren't just buying into a lobbying campaign; they're buying into a conception of self-worth and what makes a good citizen.
Yeah, and actually, so we started looking more into the local level community effect of guns and gun clubs, because in my interviews they were coming up. It wasn't initially a part of the research, and I was hearing about it from various people that I was talking to, about seeing another retiree at the local gun range, or meeting up with meeting up with, buddies at the gun club, and that's how, then I started, thinking, well, maybe I should look into, this was initially in my thesis research, and then we expanded on it, look into what this means in terms of people's social lives. And what we found is that these gun clubs, the local level gun clubs, have a lot of social activities associated with them, whether they're fishing derbies and, for children, or bingo nights, ladies'
Family
nights.
activities, building
Family
a lot more
activities.
family activities. Yeah.
And a lot of them have clubhouses and, function similarly to, as a union would in a recreational sense. So that was sort of I think that it needs a lot more research, but that was sort of why that became part of the book and the narrative that we talk about, was because people were telling us that this was relevant.
Well, also when you went through those parking lots and tallied
Oh,
the,
yeah.
the bumper stickers, it's so creative, really. Here she was stuck here at home. I don't want to be insulting, but I don't think most Harvard students liked being dumped out of their dorms within 2 days and sent home to live with their parents. Although Lainey's parents are charming. COVID. This senior thesis was done during COVID.
Yeah.
And so, I was trapped in my home as an elderly woman, going nowhere, not visiting Western Pennsylvania or any place else for a year and a half. And you were here. About one thing she could do was to drive through the parking lots of the still unionized plants and look at the bumper stickers there.
Good use of time.
Yeah.
Speaking of the bumper stickers,
Sure.
they reduce all these complex issues down to a bumper sticker.
That's what bumper
And-
stickers do.
Do you think that simplicity works?
Oh,
A lot to their favor? And are they resistant, or are people resistant? to-
Well, we don't have pictures of the parking lots back then, so you need to tell us. But I think bumper stickers always boil it down.
Hmm. Yeah, it seems to be a huge advantage to
Yeah.
put everything into a bumper sticker and just blow all the side issues away.
It's more of an indicator of other things that are going on. I don't think it just causes things, but what you display in public does matter. It does. That's why those remarkable Trump signs. I mean, one of the pictures in our book is a picture I took 2 summers ago near Erie. The man had 60 signs in his. I assume it was a man.
Yeah.
I shouldn't assume that. 60 signs in the lot. I mean, I didn't stop for long because I didn't really want to meet him. Wasn't sure that was going to work, but it was remarkable, and he was pushing MAGA candidates well beyond Trump.
Yeah.
I'm a retired teacher, and when teaching 5th grade social studies, I found that the kids did not know their own grandparents' names.
Yeah.
They didn't know anything about their families.
Oh, boy.
They could tell you all about their sports teams that they played on and their parents and all that, and clubs that their parents belonged to. And that became their family, but they've lost their family history. So
Interesting. Yeah.
that's another angle, really. And the culture has changed a lot. Like Sundays used to be, okay, go to church, spend Sunday dinner with the family, whatever. And now it's like, hurry up, get soccer practice. Nobody has family get-togethers. A lot of the kids didn't even eat with their families, like go grab something out of the refrigerator. So a lot of that breakdown.
Well, I do want to issue a note of hope. I actually think that when you give young people a chance to have the fun of looking things up, or maybe talking to grandma or grandpa or somebody that knew them
That was my
about what
assignment in
things are
class,
like, and
was to ask
we're particularly, I'm sure as a teacher you did that, and we're particularly thrilled that we're hearing from professors who assigned this book in their undergraduate classes and find that the students love it. So, Lainey was pretty special, but not the only one at Harvard who was willing to go back to where they come from and actually talk with people. This is a technique of social science research that will revolutionize the social sciences, taking us back to what they did in the 1930s.
Yes.
See, one of the things we find out with the Battle of Homestead Foundation and the Pennsylvania Labor History Society is that working people just don't stick with their history. They're always in the process of thinking, well, this is temporary, we're gonna move on with the next generation. And the most notable one, I think, was down in McKees Rocks, where in 1909, there was a big insurrection that was made front page news right beside the Evelyn Nesbit scandal, and it was worldwide. The Austrian ambassador got involved, and there was, I think, 16 different nationalities who were being exploited. Now, the people who were still living in McKees Rocks were the descendants of these people, and they knew nothing about it.
Yeah, they do.
Well, they're trying to erase everything. They're trying to erase history.
Yeah, they
Erase what happened.
But
And
then,
who's going to teach it? You know?
well, my textbook in high school, I remember, as a high school student, I remember looking through this American history textbook, and I said, well, where's the part about Homestead? And the teacher said, they won't let school history books print any story about that because they don't want it, the people with money do not want to encourage unions.
That's probably true. We had a member for a while who said he grew up in Homestead. He went to schools in Homestead, and he never heard about the 1892 battle until we got into the mills. And it was a couple of years after we got into the mills before he heard anything about it, which is very strange. You know.
Very.
Because it's a dynamic history. It's, I mean, you got the damn gunfight. OK Corral has 3 movies or 4 movies about it.
Yeah.
We don't want
Evelyn
you
Nesbit has
workers
several.
being insurrectionists.
Yeah.
You workers.
How does it get lost? You know, it's explosions and gun battles and significant issues, and actually people just going after their constitutional rights. So, how does it get lost?
I think this gentleman has been waiting, and then we'll take a couple here.
So just picking up on the issue of the history, I wonder, you know, what was, there's another book out about Pittsburgh that came out recently called The Last Shift.
The next shift.
Next Shift, yeah, which sort of talks about
Healthcare.
the life of the end of the steel industry and the transmogrification into healthcare. And in that, it's not a particularly nostalgic view of what life was like
No.
when the steel industry was here. But in what you guys have talked about, how you framed it, is that while the working conditions may have been very challenging, especially throughout history, maybe till the end of the steel industry, there's this sense that there's a totality of life. People are in community, they have relationships, they have connections. There's the union man solidarity, there's the dignity, there's all those pieces. Did you run into any nostalgia for that era? And then the second part is, you've suggested that what filled that, or what's taken that place, and I just have to say, I was in the South Hills on Friday night near some place called the Craft House, which is a bowling alley and a saloon with a guitar, with a performance area. And the bowling alley was completely packed out.
Oh, that's good.
It was huge. I mean, you couldn't park it. So people were getting together. But the question I want to ask is, the nostalgia, is the nostalgia being filled by the NRA and these sports leagues? Is the same sense of being in a totality of the community coming across in terms of the people and how they're living today? Or do people feel like, what I perceive is, there's an empty core. It's empty somehow in that the sports leagues and even the bowling alley, or even
Sort of what I was
the
saying.
NRA, that this isn't really filling people's needs. But I don't know that. I don't know what you guys saw. Do people feel like they're empty now, or do they feel and that there's something that they should have been part of if they could, but doesn't exist anymore?
They're bleeding black and gold instead of union.
I think
I'm wearing the Steelers color,
Sorry, Nana.
and I'm a Patriots fan.
Well, I shouldn't have said that.
Yeah. Well, I think that people do recognize that a lot has been lost, and I think if you go to Charleroi, as I'm sure many of you are even from, some of the towns along the Monongahela Valley that are, as one person said, like shells of their former self, of what they formerly were. They don't have, as my interviewees described, like the 7 movie theaters and all these, all this civic life and all this sort of sense of this community that was in many of these smaller towns, steelworker towns, and none of that exists anymore. And I think that a lot of people do feel a sense of loss for that. I think that I think that people can't miss or sort of reminisce about what they've never had, and so maybe some of the younger generation doesn't have a sense of loss for that, but people who have seen the transition, I think, do feel the loss that transition caused. And as Thea was saying, I think we talk about how the people are always going to try to derive a sense of community and belonging, whether it's from this group or that group, and so that need is being fulfilled in other ways now. It's not just disappeared necessarily, even though there are a lot of people in the United States now that are isolated. And
There are a lot of lonely people,
Yeah.
as far as we can tell. Yeah.
But there's still that human need, I think, and that that has transitioned to some of these more conservative influences that we've talked about.
The other thing we haven't talked about in that we signaled in the book, but I think it's fair to say that we didn't do it thoroughly because we don't have the evidence. I mean, this is a work of social science, which means it's not about just what we personally wish or we politically want. I tell my students, we gotta know the pluses and the minuses, the complexities before we decide whether we like it or not. This is a hard message to get across these days, but we know it. Religion. We've not talked about religion, and I do think there's something going on with a kind of potent combination of resentment and nostalgia that Trump is sowing. And we do know that over the last period of time, not necessarily there right away in 2016, but since then, a certain proportion of his supporters have deified him. And there are some church congregations, and I think this is pastor by pastor, congregation by congregation, I don't think it's entire denominations or all churches in an area or anything like that, that would make it easy for somebody sitting in Cambridge, Massachusetts to study it. You would have to actually go. You'd have to go to church. You'd have to listen. You'd have to do it for a year to figure this out. But there are some of these things that are fusing religious yearnings, which have to do with life and death and meaning over time, and a political idolatry that Trump has deliberately encouraged and that some are buying. And that you see at his rallies, and you see when I did some research on Trump's 2016 campaign, I went through and figured out where he held them. And not Trump himself, he's lazy, he's thinking about himself all the time, but somebody around him had figured out that all of them should be sited in these kind of decaying medium city areas, where he could signal to people, I've come here. Well, Hillary wasn't going there. I've come here, I'm with you, I understand what you've lost and who did it to you. So the who did it to you part is appealing to some people. And since religion is not gripping most Americans as much, especially in the form of regular congregational attendance, this is probably stepping in, and of course it goes along with the Fox Media, and Fox and right-wing radio and right-wing internets, and that people can spend time looking at even when they're alone. And the entire new ways of communicating. So I think there's something there, and of course that's producing some of the most terrifying
People are
aspects of
looking for
this.
Power.
Power and meaning, and getting back at people they think disrespect them. You know, I do interview conservative people. I did the Tea Party work, and people will often say to me, how can you as a Harvard professor possibly sit down, and some won't sit down with a Harvard professor. But to the degree that I have been able to do that, and I have, it's because I stress I'm a football fan. I've been married for 50 years. I was raised a Methodist. I come from Michigan. I went to Michigan State. And because I simply go to them and show respect. And people are surprised. I've had people say to me, I never thought somebody from Harvard would come here and be interested in what we have to say. Well, they're sort of right about that. It doesn't happen that much. And so I do think that that sense that we're being passed by, and we did see some of that, and it's based in reality. How can you not look at the pictures of what many of these communities were like during the 1950s, 60s, 70s? You don't have to come to Western Pennsylvania for this. I can get on my car and drive out just beyond Worcester in Massachusetts. Go to the industrial city of Ware, Massachusetts. It looks like a war zone. If you live there, and not as many people do, but if you live there, of course you're going to think you've been passed by, because actually you have.
I have a question. When you talk about the like the cult of personality around Donald Trump, do you think that would have happened with another person had it not been him, or does it kind of speak to who he was before this? Like, is this a singular event, or is this kind of fusing?
Well, it's definitely not a singular event now. It's now, it's taken over the Republican Party, which is a terrifying fact, frankly. It's got a major political party with all of its resources, with all of its patronage, with all of its legally enshrined capacity to shape the electoral process and the governing process. My take on that is that Donald Trump, first of all, he's not unique in American history. Go back to the 19th century and look at the Elmer Gantry figures, the salesman of some kind of mix of spirituality, resentment, and prosperity. So he did play a very, very important role in galvanizing that stuff the Tea Party threw up and giving it a focus and an ability to squeak through and win an election, and then reshape a lot of what you can reshape, including the federal courts, from the presidency. But now there are plenty of organized forces around him in the Republican Party and ready to move into Washington and implement. And I don't use this term lightly because I'm not a rhetoric thrower arounder, but this is fascism that we're looking at. And does he care or no? I don't know. I mean, what does the man know except himself? But that doesn't mean he can't play a role in creating a galvanizing opportunity and levers for others to use, and they're using them.
People believed that he was smart because the television show acted like he
Played a
was
big role.
a brilliant businessman when they knew he was, multiple bankruptcies and not that bright.
I don't think most people did know about the bankruptcies, and
The
he
producers
seemed, and remember in 2016, I always listen to what people are saying in restaurants. I mean, it's rude. I do. I can remember a lot of people saying, he tells it like it is. He's not afraid to speak up about about some of this gender and racial stuff that we find offensive. And he's rich and he isn't beholden to any other rich people. Ha!
Yeah, that brings to mind something to me from the 2016 election. I'm not a big fan of MSNBC. There were two things I saw in the wake of the 2016 election that really jumped out at me. One was a couple of days after the election, Morning Joe, the show I basically despise, had as their guest Michael Moore. And they let him talk, and they skipped through commercials to let him keep talking, because he had predicted that Trump would win. And they, every pundit predicted that Hillary Clinton was gonna win easily. Michael Moore said Trump's gonna win, and they said, how did you know that? He said, because I watched The Apprentice. I watched him being sold to the public as this smart, judicious business leader, which was a complete lie, but it was on every week in people's homes. The other thing I remember from that election, from the same network, was
Same network.
I think her name is Nicole Wallace.
Nicole, yeah.
Did a piece
Former
about
Republican.
Erie, and I'm from Erie. I'm come out of the GE plant in Erie.
Yeah.
And they went to Erie and they asked people, why did Trump win here? They talked to workers. They talked to people who used to have industrial jobs, people that had crappy jobs. They talked to the president of my local. And what came out of that was people repeatedly said, Hillary never came here. And also, even people who were too young to have been, politically aware when it happened, remembered NAFTA. And NAFTA, they exported our jobs. And so the idea, and I think this is true, the Democratic Party really has abandoned the working class.
Well, I don't think
People
it,
know that, and they know that-
I don't think it is now, but I do think there was plenty to go on. I mean, I may disagree with you. I think Biden represents a strand of the Democratic Party that is trying to recoup some of that. We're on your side. There's no question that Democratic politicians in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s did not step in. And I think I told this story last night in my Tea Party interviews. I finally got to the point with one man where I had enough trust that when he was telling me how important the wall was, I said, well, I don't know whether that wall is actually being built. And he said, it doesn't matter, he's trying. Well, that matters in politics. Who's trying? Who's trying to do what you think should be done? And I think the Democrats didn't do that for a period of time because they bought into these ideas about free markets and the inevitability of certain kinds of technological changes. But I would argue that Biden is making an effort. First of all, he tries to go to the places that Hillary did not. He certainly does here in Pennsylvania. He actually does believe unions matter. He might even be a little romantic about that. He made a difference for the good in the auto workers situation in Michigan. And even Barack Obama, the people around him, and Barack Obama was not great about unions, but he did step in to try to do something to keep the auto industry from completely going under. And that mattered in Ohio and Michigan in his re-election campaign in 2012.
Yeah,
So,
and I think that contrasts with, the Carter administration failing to do something like that in the 70s with the collapse of the steel industry
and the Clinton people
and
signing into
free
that.
trade, and sort of the willingness to let manufacturing collapse during those couple decades. And I agree with you that, for that period that the Democratic Party was embracing free trade, was abandoning, in many senses, American workers. But hopefully there's a contingent, as Theda said, that, has realized the mistake that was.
Well, the horse is out of the barn, mostly,
Yeah.
already. So, I mean, I don't think, we're not trying to sell nostalgia in this book. I mean, I hope, we're reporting it, but we're not trying to sell it. Well, the question is, what can you do to recreate unions in a Democratic Party that are a part of community life and family life under new circumstances? Because, we're not gonna go back, we're just not. that's not, it's too late. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to go back to your research. Which, thank you so much for doing this. I think qualitative research is so much more revealing than some of the quantitative research we're doing. I came to Pittsburgh in '91, and I thought I was moving to a foreign country. It was the most confusing place to be in the world. I ended up doing my own research, qualitative research, to try and understand some things. But one of the things, I'm dying to read your book. It seems as though you emphasize the concept of union man. One of the things that happened in Pittsburgh was that blacks integrated the unions, and then the law changed and they had to involve women as well. And I wonder if you interviewed, there's three categories. One, whether you interviewed black union workers, whether you interviewed people not in the steel mills or in the mines, because the building trades are still huge here.
Yeah,
And the
I
other
did.
thing was integrating women was huge in
It was.
Pittsburgh in the 1970s and 80s. And I wonder if you interviewed any women or blacks.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, we did. And I think that that was a difficult transition period for both sides, but particularly for people coming in to the industry, for women and for black workers. I think that over time what happened was that these newcomers were accepted into the union and embraced as, not union men necessarily, but as union women, or as, just members of the union. That took time though. It was not all, smooth sailing throughout, and
It certainly
particularly in the
See if
building
I got
trades.
that bit button I have about a union.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's see if I can find it. We have a PowerPoint with all these visuals,
Oh,
which we did not.
I had an adventure. I was working in a.
Woman's place is in the union. There's our button. And,
These ladies work in the trade.
yeah.
Great.
And we have a whole part of it that's about something that gets overlooked in a lot of union research, which depends on surveys that ask people, are you a union member or not? And maybe they ask public sector versus private sector, but they don't ask which union.
right.
So we've got a comparison of the Brotherhood of Electrical Workers with the steel workers, and don't misunderstand. This isn't a book just about men or even about what's in people's heads. The concept in our book is in quotes.
Mm-hmm.
That means it was a way of when women first came in, I suspect they were union men too. I mean, I know that in my occupation, Harvard professors, the first women, we just wanted to be professors. That was a huge struggle to be accepted as professors. Some of my students originally called me sir. And I learned to accept it because it was better than the alternative. And I know that in some of the interviews you did, the African Americans and the women would talk about the struggles they went through. Some of the white workers did too, admitting that things were not hunky-dory at all, as of course they weren't, in terms of accepting people into work groups or into the union's operations. But then they would also talk about the pride they came to feel about standing with others and that the advantages they'd gotten from union membership. So we try to explore that through some of the interviews, where people are talking about a process that is not smooth. It was often kind of one step forward, 2 steps back, or 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The comparison with the IBEW is really important in the book, even though it doesn't take up much space. Because since our whole argument about the steelworkers is that the steelworkers union could count on the fact that union life was embedded in communities next to the plants, so that people were living and working close to, in the same places, particularly here in Western Pennsylvania, and that community ties, recreational activities, children's activities, the involvement of entire families and of the ladies' auxiliaries, for the women who were in there doing community activities and raising children, which is work, by the way. That's work. That they just weren't necessarily in the steel jobs. That they could count on that entire web of ties that Democrats were part of. They were part of those things at the local level. We show that. They could count on that, creating a sense of this is what a union person does, including this is what a union person does in politics. But the electrical workers and other trades can't count on that because their work is not co-located. It's based on the teams that you were talking about that travel around. And so in our newsletter analysis, we showed that over the decades, the electrical workers newsletter made an effort to have people write in about their personal lives and their family and community lives so that they could build that larger kind of what would be called in social science an imagined community that wasn't just taking for granted that everybody was living and working in the same place. Oddly, that then makes them more suited to the world we're in now, where a lot of the underpinnings of the Steelworkers Union have fallen apart. That's a key argument, and for our fellow scholars, particularly the economists who study labor unions, it's saying, get down from the level of abstraction and look at actual unions, how they're organized, how they link work and family and community, or if they do, in different ways. If you want to understand the political side effects.
Sure.
I was wondering if you found a factor of the disinformation that is rampant in what everybody's hearing these days. I saw an interview with a union worker and a reporter, and the union worker was saying, he thought that Trump was strong on what he cared about, and he cared about being a union man. And the guy showed him a video of Trump saying that he thought the right to work was the way to go, and the union guy was like, I can't believe that. I have to change my whole way of thinking. And there's so much, I heard a woman who had diabetes and was so thankful of Trump taking care of medicine for diabetics.
Oh my.
Yeah, we're fighting a battle that is a hard one to watch. The right to work to me is like right to be exploited,
Yeah.
It's out there on Fox and other stations and.
Sure, they're propaganda channels. They're spreading lies all the time. Talk about what we're doing.
And I think one of the things that we looked at was the sources of information that used to exist amongst union communities, and how that has really changed. So
Labor newspapers.
yeah, labor newspapers,
Labor radio stations.
Newsletters that were of the local, and then the magazines that the International put out. Many different sources of information that people were getting, and that were coming from unions, which were talking
Close to
about
them.
close to them, and talking about what policies were advancing their interests, or what candidates were in certain circumstances. And now I think that people are consumed by different media streams, and sort of siloed in that, and the sources of information that unions have their labor newspapers have mostly disappeared, for example.
Or they just cover stuff that's happening in Washington.
Yeah. And
Do they use social media?
some, yeah.
So,
But a lot of people are very tuned into right-wing media sources, which is hard to break away from.
the Democratic Party also has to come into this, and I would say that Democrats have been slow to learn, something that Republicans had some advantage in learning because they had links to church communities and for quite a while. But there are some states where the memo has been received, and Democrats and kind of connected groups are trying to be a presence all the time, and to just weave political facts and political outlooks into daily conversation. it's not really a policy matter. You can't just sit down with people and ask them to read a policy book. I'm a political scientist. It takes me years to understand some of this stuff. How could we expect regular people of any kind to master all the complexities, let alone who's responsible? I mean, in some work I did with another student about Georgia and North Carolina, I discovered that the network around Stacey Abrams, which is a whole set of different groups, they learned the hard way, starting in 2013, that a lot of people in the sort of rural areas and medium city areas didn't know why they weren't getting the Medicaid expansion under Obamacare. The field workers had people say to them, why does President Obama not want me to get Medicaid? When of course it was the Republicans in the state legislature that didn't want them to get Medicaid. That's still true in 10 states, heavily African American and Latino American states. So they figured out they've got to work with natural networks, with year-round presence, with people who can just kind of explain things bit by bit, including how to deal with the next round of changes about how you vote. They're changed every year. And so somebody's got to be there. So, you know, obviously the church communities among African Americans, but I remember this one interview with an organizer in southwestern Georgia around Albany. She said, we use the funeral directors networks. And I immediately realized how brilliant that was, because black communities under segregation had to have their own funeral directors. They've always been one of the most powerful business sectors in the black community, and people go there regularly. So they got the messages out by making sure the funeral directors were conveying correct information about some kinds of things. The moral of the story is really straightforward. Whatever population you're dealing with, it doesn't matter, it's going to be different for different populations. Figure out where they interact. Figure out where they, you know, who they come into contact with, and is there a way to tap into that network?
You have to target the message to your audience.
You do.
My husband's cousin's daughter is Rachel Sweet. She spearheaded the campaign in Kentucky, Kansas, and Ohio to preserve women's health care rights. And I could listen to her talk forever, you know, because she's very astute at getting messages across.
But see, that's why an ongoing organized local presence is so important. I mean, I remember when I was studying the anti-Trump resistance groups. I mean, I was in North Carolina, and in a county where actually the people who identified themselves as the local leaders of these groups in 2017, one of the young women got fired from her job. That's how serious it is. The stakes were high, and yet they were doing it anyway. But they conducted their Save Obamacare campaign by talking about health care as pro-life. They're in a community that at that time, it was pre-Dobbs, was all pro-life churches all the time. So they just said something that I think to an ordinary human being kind of makes sense, that health care is pro-life. And they didn't have anybody tapping on the shoulder like they just tapped President Biden on the shoulder and said, don't use that word illegal. You know, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say this, but I went berserk when I read that this morning, that he'd apologized for that, and I know exactly where that's coming from. That's coming from his 20-somethings in the White House that told him, you can't use that word. Well, if you can't use it about somebody who's been accused of rape and murder, I'm not sure who you could use it for. And my reaction is going to be the same as 99% of Americans. So stop worrying about that and talk to people in the language they understand. And they were successful in this community like they were in other communities, and getting people to say, wait a minute, might be Obamacare, but I don't really want to lose that.
Another question? Where are we?
Yeah, one more. Lainey, you said, I'm curious to know if, when you started this project, were you surprised by any of the results, and has it changed kind of the context of you being from here?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start by answering, when I was looking through doing, reading reading the literature before I started actually reaching out to people and talking to people here in Western Pennsylvania, I kept wondering why the literature hadn't talked or hadn't really addressed the community nature of unions essentially at all. And that to me was really curious, because my understanding from family and from family friends about unions was not only that, about the economic collective bargaining unit that they were, but also, the other functions that they played. And so I came into the project kind of wanting to understand that dimension. I think I was surprised by some of the I was definitely surprised by some of the sort of routes that the research ended up taking. So, for example, I had no awareness of a gun, like the gun club social components that we ended up talking a good bit about. And I had no awareness really of the extent of the community life that unions had built. I think I went into it sort of being like, well, I'm sort of curious about the community, how unions encourage political activity. But when we got into the research, we found just how integrated they were. I mean, brick and mortar union halls with banquet halls and basketball courts and bars and whatnot.
And weddings held in the union hall.
And just really integral parts of the community that were connected not only with, connected with each other, but also with other institutions. And understanding that sort of web of connections and sort of the fact that the product of that was the identity that we ended up sort of talking about was really interesting. So I was expecting maybe a more sort of direct route to political I guess choices, but it ended up being that was the basis of how people self-identified and became sort of loyal to their union, loyal to Democrats.
Well, and the Democrats had to be there
Yeah.
and be part of these things. And we found some nice old newspaper ads where a candidate for state office, this was in Pennsylvania, was listing all of the local groups he was part of, all the things he was doing with people.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't just saying, here's my policy about wages, which I think, that 1955 survey we found a survey conducted by the University of Chicago for the steel workers. And I suspect there are more of these resources out there.
Mm-hmm.
Union leaders are not really willing to hand these internal surveys over to scholars. You have to be, people who work with me learn to be persistent sleuths.
Yes.
If there's not, if Route 1 doesn't work, you try Route 2. That's how I got all the lists of everything going on in Indivisible, all the Coke Network stuff. It's all networks. It's all networks. But this survey was wonderful because it was so dense. It asked hundreds of questions. And it's so striking. Back in 1955, which would have been the heyday of big labor and the tight Democratic Party ties, union workers told the surveyors at the University of Chicago they didn't like it that the union bosses were making endorsements. They didn't think the union bosses should be involved in formal politics. The same thing they tell the reporters now when the reporters arrive.
Mm-hmm.
But they did like it that there was lots of investment in local civic activities.
Mm-hmm.
And of course the Democrats at that time were there, and they knew that. They were worming their way in from the bottom up. So they were with people, not telling people or being endorsed from above.
John F. Kennedy visited the little mining town.
Yeah, those pictures of him
Fredericktown.
going into West Virginia are just
He was in
incredible.
Fredericktown, Pennsylvania, in the Mon Valley, and drank at the local bar down there.
Well, I have a historian friend named Ellen Fitzpatrick who we should invite sometime. She wrote the book Letters to Jackie, which was all about all the letters that tens of thousands of Americans wrote to Jackie Kennedy after John F. Kennedy was killed. And she selected from them, she had to get permission of their heirs to use the letters. But some of the most touching ones were from working people in West Virginia and other parts of the Rust Belt, describing what it was like when Kennedy visited. And this was a Catholic who was trying to convince you know, people who had been told that Catholics, you could never vote for a Catholic. But his being there, there are pictures of him sitting next to members of the mine workers and talking with people face to face about their specific concerns. I mean, that's presidential politics, but I think really thorough research would look much more thoroughly at what was going on at those the local offices, the county offices, the state legislature, all of that.
John Jablonski was very involved in politics. My niece is partnered with his grandson. And, you know, just, so the politicians knew to interact with the union officers and to get close, you know, to union people to see what they wanted and would tailor their campaigns to get the votes. And like you said before, that's changed and it's.
Well, and you know, I did do a little bit of research on Trump's 2016 campaign, and in addition to mapping the location of his big rallies, which are impersonal, they're shows, they're like the Apprentice.
Yes.
I mean, he has those skills, he does.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, if I had to pick between Ron DeSantis and him,
I'm wondering if he has a BS degree.
yeah, BS degree. Well, he does, and of course that's.
Please.
But here's the thing, the other thing that we did in that research was to say, okay, take all the list of places that Hillary Clinton went and all the places that Trump went, set aside the rallies, because rallies are kind of artificially constructed events. What actual naturally occurring organizations did they speak in front of? In other words, organizations that would be meeting whether they were there or not.
Yeah.
And the answer for Trump, Hillary was talking to everybody, except she wasn't going everywhere, and I don't think she was talking to union leaders very much. If so, they were the international leaders. But Trump was talking in front of Fraternal Order of Police lodges. They endorsed him. They hadn't endorsed Romney. It made a difference throughout the Rust Belt. We were able to tie that down statistically. He was talking in front of gun clubs and the NRA convention, and he was talking in front of Christian pastors' meetings, and border guard.
Yeah.
Border guards. So he knew what he was doing. Somebody knew what he was doing.
Right. Strategist.
And he didn't talk in front of these kind of natural networks very often, but he was tapping into that. Well, what are those? Those are the places that reach people beyond the outer suburbs, and sometimes it's called rural. I don't think rural's right. I think it's, you know, small cities, medium city, non-metro, not fast-growing economic areas. But in the American political system, they carry a lot of weight in the Electoral College, and they carry a lot of weight in Senate and House races, even if population is going down. So.
Did you have?
Me?
Yeah.
Me. I was just going to comment about something that Lainey had said earlier when she was doing her research. My name's Sandy. I was 32 years a member of Local 542 Sprinkler Fitters.
Oh, right.
Along with my co-worker here, Michelle, probably about the same, 30-some years.
A little bit longer.
And very naive. And before I got into the Sprinkler Fitters, I was trying to get in with the police department, and a friend of mine said, "What's your party affiliation?" I said, "I'm a Republican. I grew up in a Republican household, Protestant, you know." And he said, "Change your party affiliation to Democrat. Just do that. Trust me. Just do that." So I was in my early 20s and changed my party affiliation to Democrat. Didn't get the job with the police, but ended up getting the job with the union pipe fitters. They always encourage us to vote Democratic because that was in our best interest. And later in my career, now we have a black man as president. My particular local was very racist. not many black members. And I think now they might have one. No women. We've all retired and they have 0 women. But my local was a Pittsburgh local. They were union men. And when you put a choice in front of them of a black man for president, that hate grew in their hearts, and no way were they gonna vote for a woman. I mean, we had the black man, but when Hillary, no way. I think their mentality was anybody but Hillary. And then we got Donald.
And how do they feel about Donald?
Oh,
A lot of them voted for him.
yeah, they voted.
No, I understand.
And they're not voting for their own best interest. They're voting Republican because we don't want any more black politicians. We don't want any women, and they're coming for our guns.
Well, even though our international came out and, endorsed the Democratic candidate, they still voted against.
Yeah.
It was just
No,
amazing
and I
to me.
think that's happening now, even in the union networks that have less made this transition. That's what our limited data show. I will say this: in 2016, the Trump co was still alive, and the mine workers, by then much shrunken in West Virginia, along with the coal industry. My sister lives there. They made a real effort. They went door to door for many weekends. They got it within 5 percentage points. Now that didn't win the state, so you can say, oh, who cares? And the Democratic consultants would all say, who cares? But I think it shows that. Let me read a quote from Laney's research that's in the book. I want to read this because it's a point that we're trying to make. That's in the research too. This was a supervisor, I think, who was in touch with a lot going on in West Virginia, so the mining industry. A while back, now this was a while ago, he says, I was talking to a guy who had recently asked a miner he had a lot of respect for about the Ku Klux Klan. The miner gave a very right-on talk about how we in the United Mine Workers, we don't care about color, we believe in equality and all that. And then when he was done, he said, but if it wasn't for all that, I'd probably be in the KKK. So for us, at least, that's a theme. We don't deny that these attitudes exist and can be activated. And I guess I want to set aside color because I'd like to come back to gender in just a minute. I think that's underrated for what happened in 2016 and what's happening now. But if there are countervailing ties, and if those ties are at the peer level, not just leaders telling you what to do, or if they're at the contact and have repeated conversations level, is how I would put it, they can counteract a lot of possible prejudices. And we can hardly go back to the middle of the 20th century and say that prejudices were not very powerful. They were very powerful. I mean, it wasn't necessarily just white versus black, or women were hardly there in a lot of these workplaces. It was Italians versus Irish in Boston. I mean, come on. Or all the different Slavic groups, Croatians, Slovakians, Ukrainian Americans, Germans. I mean, they were all at each other's throats to some degree. But the union managed to build some bridges across that, partly out of struggles and partly by this distant work of messages and ties that countervailed it, didn't squelch it, didn't remove it, didn't leave it as something that couldn't come out again. And guns were always there. These guys were always hunting. I mean, the newsletters we've got are full of information about hunting. There were shooting clubs.
Sure.
Of course there were. Gender's tougher, I think, and I think underestimated. I think that the level at which Donald Trump has been able to tap into visceral anger about professional women, and think about it for a minute, Hillary was the wrong person at the wrong time for that one. It's not her fault. Nobody thought that Donald Trump was going to be the nominee when she started out. But she's not a great retail politician, and she sort of epitomized these professional women who are taking jobs that you don't think they ought to have and telling you what to do. And that's not even when you get down to the level of blue-collar workplaces where women can be it's just tough all around. I mean, my sense of it from talking to the people that go to my diner is that women have been putting up with nonsense in these places for a long, long time. Blue-collar women are tougher about that than college women are. But the men also must find it, they get irritated if somebody says you can't have a nude picture in your locker.
It wasn't even that.
Or just, she's telling me what to do.
Oh, yeah, they had to do.
And she reminds me of my wife who's telling me what to do.
Yeah.
And the wife is thinking, if I don't tell him what to do, it won't get done. All of these things are there, and they're still there. So they're there to tap.
It's a deeper thing than naked pictures on the toolbox. It's much deeper than that.
Well, of course it is.
That's
Why
very
wouldn't
obnoxious.
it be? We're only one generation, we're only my lifetime away.
I put a picture of a nude man up there and, oh man, that was terrible. Try that.
I didn't think I would care for it myself, but, you know.
Sure.
I was thinking about that dynamic with Nikki Haley.
Uh-huh.
That she was the one that was left, and she was a woman of immigrant parents. And I said, how are those misogynistic, racist Republicans going to vote for her?
They didn't.
No, but if something happens to Trump, and she was the only one left standing, and she became the nominee, I don't think that would have been anybody that Republican then would have voted.
If something happens to Trump I'm not, social science of the kind we do is not good at prediction, but I'll make this prediction. If something happens to him between now and November, whoever he's designated as vice president is who's going to be plugged in, not Nikki Haley. And he was going after her. He was making statements about her original name. He was definitely mocking her. I can't remember what gender mockery he was using. I can't keep up with all of this mockery. I've stopped, but gender mockery is a big part of what he does. No question. Yeah.
You're touching on a topic that is kind of coming up in how people describe the split that's occurred in American society with the folks who've gone to college and the folks who don't get to go to college. Obviously, the flood of women into colleges in our lifetimes has been an extraordinary thing. I think it adds an extra element to this concept of the meritocracy and who's emerging in the meritocracy. You mentioned that union men felt respected. There is a sense here that the resentment is about this lack of respect for failing in the meritocracy. And I wonder how do we confront that? Because even talking about it with Harvard professors connotes an element of law school students, connotes a challenge because we're trying to understand something that in fact the folks want to run away from. They actually want to disrespect that conversation and the notion of learning. So how do we do a somersault that gets us behind that problem in a way that you can have this conversation without automatically being dismissed? And I don't know if you guys are running into that conversation.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, I tell my inequality seminar that I teach every spring, there are two kinds of inequality that have grown since the late 1970s. They've really grown out of control in America. And one of them is the one that I think people on the left feel very comfortable talking about, which is the 1% versus the 99%. The pulling away of these narcissistic, arrogant billionaires who think, all of whom think they should run everything, and there are a lot of them. There are
People who
really
think if
a
you
lot.
have money, you're smart.
But the other pulling away has been the top 20% from everybody else. And those top 20% are professionals and managers who have been not just to college but to postgraduate, and who have married each other, and who are raising their children very differently than everyone else is able to do, or sometimes wants to do. And that chasm is the chasm of, there are people telling you what to do, and a lot of them are women. That doesn't usually say, it doesn't have to be, because people know it. And I think that's very real. And how do you counter it? I think you counter it the only way that we would know how, and that is to talk. This is a responsibility the colleges have got to take on themselves, including the most arrogant university of all, which is the one we're from. Arrogance, thy name is Harvard. Sit down with fellow faculty members, in my case, with students, I always do, and say that we've got to talk about the inherent value of work and of each person. And that means everybody, including people you don't agree with politically or culturally. And in some ways, the biggest divide is this divide that would divide the university cities from the hinterlands where people are voting for Trump. You have to, this is such an old-fashioned idea, and so I think it's inadequate. But it's an idea that was inherent to American culture for a long time. I've studied American voluntary associations from the 19th century on, and the thing that they did was to bridge classes and occupations as well as places, and they taught explicitly in their rituals and in their speeches, every person's worth is dependent not simply on how much money they make. They also said not just on how much education they got. Think what a shocking idea that is to say to people at Harvard. How can it be that your worth is not dependent on what degree you got? It's a kind of basic Christian idea, isn't it? It's kind of a basic American idea. I don't know. I mean, I think we have to revive it. And we one conversation at a time.
Anyone else? Anything on your mind? With all the people you talk to, now you have some of these people who are, just going to wipe out they want no more parts of the Democratic Party because they don't feel they've been supported. And that included some of the officers and leaders you talked to, right?
Sure. Locals.
Did they have any speculations on what would happen to their union card if an authoritarian government under Trump got in? Or did they just wipe that out? And
Well, we haven't done any interviews on that yet.
Yeah, so most of my interviews were 2020 to 2022, so this was a little bit, early 2022. So this was before sort of that kind of took over the whole political narrative. But I did talk to some people about January 6th, including some Republican and Democratic chair people of various counties in this region, who had interesting things to say about January 6th and downplayed the role, and talked about Antifa on the Republican side. That was pretty big. But I think that there is a certain level of denial about about the possibility of a authoritarian, the reality that could set in if Trump is reelected. I don't know about how people would understand it relative to their union, but I do think that a lot of people are in denial.
I've decided to start talking about this to people that I speak with outside of academia in very concrete terms. Here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to say, how are you going to feel if Trump and his people get in there, and you think that you want that, and the economy goes really bad, and you can't throw the bums out. I'm gonna use exactly that phrase, because that's such a valued thing in America, to be able to throw the bums out.
I'm sorry, I can't.
Can't hear you back here.
Can't-
How will you feel if Trump and his people get in there, the economy goes bad, and you can't throw the bums out?
That's why you got guns. I'm sorry.
You think they're gonna turn their guns against
I'm not-
Trump?
I mean, I'm
No,
not
they
saying
will
that.
not. And I get that just ask people to think about it. How are you going to feel if there's a 20% tariff on economic goods and everything you buy at Walmart costs twice as much as it does now? In other words, make it concrete. I don't think it'll work with very many people, but it only needs to work with 1 out of 25 to turn the election.
Human nature, they'll just find an ethnic group to blame.
Well, I think immigration, I'm gonna say this, then you may all disagree. In the interviews I did in conservative areas, and that's separate from this research, I did find that immigration was an area where you could get a level of ambivalence. Once people started thinking about their actual neighbors, or the people that were making their family business work. I mean, I'll give you an example from a county in Wisconsin I visited. Okay, very, very Republican, very Trumpy, increasingly Trumpy, probably more Trumpy now. I haven't been back because the COVID grounded me too. But one guy said to me his family ran a dairy farm. And it had dawned on him that if the policies continued that the local police chief told me about, which is that under previous Democratic and Republican presidents, they got notification when INS was coming in to take somebody. Under Trump, they just came in and took somebody's cousin or somebody's brother or somebody's father with no notice to even the local police. This guy, it had dawned on him that his family farm wasn't going to work anymore. If he couldn't count on Jose to come in, or if he got sick for his cousin to come, because the family as a whole would move back to Mexico. See, these families are not separate, as you all know. There are undocumented people who are part of the overall family network. And if the family as a whole thinks that so-and-so will not be able to return to the United States, they all go to avoid that. So I've found very conservative business people from the Midwest saying, wait a minute, this isn't what we want. The other place of ambivalence is schools and churches. I mean, people in this community told me about how it had been 20 years now since the first ones had come. There were families being raised. Their children knew the other children in school. It was very scary when INS came in and the parents were afraid, the children were afraid their parents would be taken away. Sometimes they were. In one of the Ohio counties I visited, they were taken away. At work, they were just grabbed at work, taken away.
Yeah.
The owner of one of these businesses said, we have a plant in the other part of the state, and when we knew the INS was coming in, we sent all our undocumenteds there, and then we brought them back. Well, you can't do that if there's no notice. And they did identify that with Trump. And they did, the man at the Catholic Church said, these are our neighbors, we like them now. So I think making it concrete, instead of discussing it in these highly abstract terms, bring it down and say, what is it going to mean if your kid's soccer team, the player that your boy is best friends with, if his dad is taken away? And it's not as if none of this is true. It's all very true. So you can, and he's promising to do this. He's promising to do this. Take him seriously and spell it out. But spell it out. Don't treat it as an abstraction. I think it's hard. It's very easy for people to parry abstractions.
Well, pretty good. Since they've been able to divide union members with wedges put between them, we're using the gun issue and abortion and so forth. Do you see any wedges we can use to get back at them? History? I don't know. Al's union, the UE, I think does more.
Inflation,
Or has done more
reproductive
than-
rights has been redefined as a freedom issue.
Mhm.
Americans believe in freedom, and that's across all lines. Why is it that the reproductive rights forces are winning every battle? It's because it's a freedom issue. Of course, there are issues where you could drive a wedge. That's what politics is about.
I think that would be a big deal. It's gonna be a real big deal. So,
Being as how, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay, go ahead.
Seeing as how we have a historical sponsor here, do you think unions could do any more with connecting their members to history?
Sure.
Would that help? I think Al's union does a lot on that.
History?
Yeah, I mean, you had Labor's Untold Story, a book you put out,
Right.
and, you know, the newsletter connected well with your members, I think.
Have any of the unions just asked people to check with their parents or grandparents and find out what their experience was like? And make it something people can do individually and write about. But that's, I'm sure that's what good teachers do.
I think that bumper sticker that people brought you the weekend, I mean, some people think it's not, you know, trouble. I think a lot of young people have their right to keep it, no matter what, the unions did anything like that then.
We added it to our curriculum in our apprenticeship classes. There wasn't really a history segment in it. We have a 5-year apprenticeship in the pipe trades. And the history they were teaching was just about the pipe trades. It wasn't about the whole labor movement per se. And I was the training coordinator for many years, but so I added that part of labor history, you know, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, all the disasters that happened because of safety issues, and the laws that were passed to help us organize, that kind of thing. They didn't know that.
No, of course
Where are they
not.
learning it?
Nobody teaches this.
Right, nobody teaches it, so.
Thank you.
Unions are what got us child labor laws.
Yeah. Pictures
Those
of
are
Breaker
now being
Boys.
threatened. You know that. Those
And
are
they
now
want to
being
brag.
Well, now that, you know, back to.
They are, yes. Let's legalize child labor.
Well, that's happening.
I know, yeah.
It's happening.
What?
I'm glad you did. I tried to get our apprentice director to include history, and he said, it's not in the curriculum, I can't put it in.
Oh, come on.
But the international president called me 2 weeks ago, and he said, do you be interested in doing a book on explaining, a children's book, on explaining to our members' kids what it's all about? And I said, sure, you know. He said, well, we gotta get a grant first. I don't know why they gotta get a grant, just do it.
Great idea.
So, anyhow, hopefully that'll work out, but I don't know.
Hope it does.
Are there any K through 12 teachers here? Yeah.
I
Can
taught
do
fourth
things.
grade, and there was a part of the chapter about unionism, and there was a picture of these little, it must have been 100 little boys standing in front of a coal mine, and I got a question from a parent. Why is that part of the curriculum? Why are you teaching about unions? I said, it's history. I didn't write this, I didn't say it that way. But there were a lot of, it's not universally accepted that children need to learn anything about anything that would offend anybody these days, so I'm glad I'm out of the classroom.
Would it work to ask the children to just find out what their grandparents did?
Yeah.
Which is a little bit more, it will probably generate some of the same stories, but they won't be coming from something, one of these are highly politically organized protests. And they're organized by a very small number of people. But I understand that when school boards, the equivalent of universities is, you know, pussyfooting administrators don't stand up to things, then you're in trouble. But I do think that it's hard now with young people to give them any sense of how things have changed and how, if you don't remain vigilant, they'll get reversed.
I knew that the kids didn't have a lot of feeling of family, and so their reward for positive behavior at the end of every class was story time, and I would tell them stories from my family.
Mhm.
And I would work in my grandfather, when he was 5, watched the Pinkertons beat up the Union guys across the street, you know. So when I put it across, story time is just, oh, it's Mrs. Bosey's family, and I didn't get any complaints.
And did you get some good questions from the youngsters?
Always, yeah.
All good.
They loved it. In fact, you know, a lot of them went on to college to study history and different things, so.
Yeah, no, I think, my sister is a historical society person in West Virginia, and she works to try to get these stories out, and in an environment that's pretty conservative. I mean, you know.
Where is she in West Virginia?
Lewisburg.
Pardon?
Lewisburg. She was, my brother-in-law is, well, I guess he's one of the only Democratic businessmen in West Virginia, but he's from a multi-generational mining family.
I taught in West Virginia when I first got out of college.
They were at Pax. They were near Pax, near Beckley and Pax.
Yeah, I was at Rollsburg and Aurora. So.
I think back here. Back,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just to your question, I was sitting here thinking about it for the last 10 minutes. In 1980, I was working at the Erie GE plant. I was the editor of the local newsletter. And we used history to, I think with some effectiveness, to immunize our members against Ronald Reagan. Because Ronald Reagan in the 50s had been a washed up Hollywood actor who General Electric hired, put him on TV, had him going around the country giving right-wing speeches for them, which later became the basis of his stump speech. So we did an article about that. I had the great Fred Wright, somebody who you know, Bill, do a cartoon, custom cartoon showing Reagan as a flunky for GE. And I know from people that are in that plant now that over the last few years they've had, you know, whole networks of Trumper members in our union. We didn't have that in the 80s. We didn't have people. People were, if they were for Reagan, they kept it to themselves. We didn't have people like openly proclaiming themselves supporters of Reagan. And I don't take all the credit for that, but I think equating Reagan with the company, you know, kind of helped do that by bringing up this history. So there is some data. The other thing about, I just want to say one thing about West Virginia. I was an organizer for the union in the 90s in West Virginia. We were trying to organize a GE plastics plant in Parkersburg. I remember going to small towns a bit inland from there, and noticing in the local general store that had a rack with it, you know, not DVDs, what do they call VHSs to rent, and it would be all the top movies from a year ago, plus Matewan. Matewan was very popular in West Virginia, and I found in West Virginia, you know, which has really gone down the tubes in the last 2 years politically, that people knew who Mother Jones was.
Yeah, they did.
They knew
I
who
think
Lewis
this is
was.
pretty.
They knew their labor history more than any other place that I've lived, and I've lived a few places.
Well, you know, our research on Western Pennsylvania showed that a lot of things that some of the Republican chairs were attributing to the Reagan era actually happened only recently. I mean, it's not that there wasn't erosion of a lot of things, but this Trump period, this is a realignment of the Republican Party into a full blue-collar, it's full. And it's an authoritarian party, which is terrifying in a two-party system, because there are a lot of people who think I'm just voting for the other ones. But think about the most effective pushback about Michigan. It was the news that I did think even got into the right-wing sources, that Trump had gone to a non-union plant
Oh, that was.
to claim that he was a union, that he was supporting the workers. And for once, the reporters actually did it. I guess they were Michigan reporters who were out there interviewing people who actually found out that some of the people carrying blue-collar workers or union workers for Trump signs were
Or even.
not in any unions.
Hey,
Uh,
gee, false news, what?
Well, the false news thing is a really serious problem.
It is.
So if, just listening to this conversation, I'm wondering, what we've been talking about is the sort of the death of any kind of pro-social organizing element in American society. With the union being maybe not fully dead, but under a lot of assault and trying to think about a resurgence. What do you guys see as the basis for pro-social social organizing as opposed to what we're seeing on the authoritarian side, antisocial social organizing? What is the basis that's going to bring us together? I mean, it used to be mass employment. It used to be, like you were talking about, the steelworkers living together, even though they moved out of, Braddock and they moved to, Plum. They're still living together. What's going to bring us together? Where does that? What is the force in our economy or in our society right now that brings us together rather than splits us? Do we have any? What is the place to go to?
I think it sort of harkens back to something Theda said earlier, which is it's place dependent. Like, you have to understand the differences between different communities, and and it's not going to be the same type of institution across this community and that community, and that's why I think it's so important that Democrats, on the local level, are integrated into and knowledgeable about where people are getting together. I mean, what churches host events and what, associations are involved in this and that. So I don't know if there's a single answer to the question, but it is true. I mean, Theda's done an enormous amount of research on American civic life, and her book from 2002, I think, Diminished Democracy, looked at civic associations and particularly fraternal and ethnic groups over time, and just the decline that those organizations have gone through. And it is true that there's less pro-social sort of engagement now than before, and a lot more on the internet and virtual and whatnot. But people still, I think, have a need to get together and socialize and see one another and talk and have a community. And so I think it depends on the town, the community, the city, but it's important to be knowledgeable about what places are people are interacting in.
Yeah, the other thing I think you're asking about is who's articulating that we want leaders who are thinking about all of us and what's good for us. Why is it that it just sounds corny now when Joe Biden says it? I'm glad he's saying it. I did do research on both the Tea Party wave of organizing that broke out when Obama was elected, and then the anti-Trump grassroots movements that broke out when Trump was elected. That was also, a lot of that used Pennsylvania, but it was nationwide. There were 3,000 groups formed, regularly meeting local groups formed, when Trump was first elected. Wrote about this in the book Upending American Politics, which also includes work by students, some Harvard senior theses around the country. But my research kind of nailed down that these were mainly older women who were organizing these groups, which, by the way, the Democratic Party consultants didn't like that. They didn't even want to acknowledge it. It's kind of embarrassing. I bridge these worlds, and so I hear all the sides. But they were librarians, they were teachers, they were healthcare workers, they were small business women. The men who were with them were usually their husbands or partners or friends. There were as many of those groups organized in every kind of community across America, because we've got a list of all 3,000 of them. And we have a list of all 2,000 to 3,000 tea parties that were organized. So we know where they were organized. And both of these were nationwide movements of people who were actually volunteering for exactly opposite goals and values. But relevant to your point, we did manage to conduct a survey in Pennsylvania. We got to know enough connectors that we could conduct a statewide survey. And so we had the reasons people joined these groups. Why were they mobilized? And yes, hatred of Trump was certainly part of it. But the most important reason was somebody's got to stand up for what our democracy cares about together. Somebody's got to be public spirited. That kind of language was used. And so I believe that, and in the black community you see the same thing with older African American church women. They not necessarily join these same groups, but in states like in the South, they are the mainstays. They're the ones who will even tell their grandkids, get off the couch and go vote, and cut it out with that. They're very authoritative in their families. So I think that women do matter in this, not because of any biological determinism. I'm an equality person. I believe in equality. And I'm well aware that women can mess up just as well as men. We have a constitutional right to mess up just as well. That's the way I feel about it. But, I mean, women are often the ones that make community and public spirited things work. Even in the Tea Party, they were the ones that organized the meetings, even if they weren't the public face. So I think that is a reservoir, and we do know that such people have moved toward the Democrats. I think they're sometimes an undervalued resource as organizers and as articulators of values. But it's really important to reestablish this idea that each person is worth more than their income and their formal education, that work is dignified no matter. I don't think you're going to get away from the value that Americans place on work, and I don't think we should. I'm that much of an American patriot. I think work is important. But there are a lot of kinds of work, including caring work in families. It doesn't have to be paid. It can be civic work. We have to just talk about those things. And we have to start insisting that the newspapers cover some of that. We have to start insisting that our institutional leaders become less cynical and place a value on those things. You know, throw a dinner for somebody who's done a lot to build whatever it is, like the unions always used to do. Battle is not lost yet. It's teetering on the edge, but it has not been lost yet.
Okay. We're running low on time. We're running out of time.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. If you want to find out more about the Battle of Homestead Foundation, go to our website, www.battleofhomestead.org. And as our speaker said today, just get involved locally with your politics, with the politics you like and support. You know, just go to a meeting, go to a school board meeting, go to a council meeting, city or county council, just get involved. Get involved with groups like the Battle of Homestead Foundation, which is about history, or the Squirrel Hill Historical Society. There's societies in Lawrenceville. Just get out and meet other people where we talk. I'm a member of a theater company here in town that puts on a lot of educational theater plays. You would be surprised how many people, first of all, don't go to live theater anymore. Second of all, you'd be surprised that they enjoy it when they do, because they actually not only get information from what's on stage, but they actually see other people, and there are spontaneous conversations that happen in theater lobbies, and when you're sitting next to a person. So again, Americans, we just have to do this. Stop the bowling alone thing, which was another great book in the 90s. Just, it's good to bowl alone to practice, but essentially join that league. Want to thank White Whale Books.
Yes.
Thank you.
For bringing in, being the first to step up and bring in our authors, and everybody know White Whale Bookstore up in Bloomfield. If you have, okay, don't embarrass yourselves. If you haven't gone, go there, and you can also find them online. They're very kind to come here today as well, and buy a book. Once again, I'm not sure how everybody found out about our event here today. The best way is to be on our mailing list. So just go to that website, sign up. or fill out a membership form, or even just sign up on the email list. And thanks again for authors who are doing great research. Thanks again for the union people who are, know their history and are also very interested in getting it out. So thanks a lot. And any more questions or any thoughts?
Bill has a point
Oh, Bill has
before you
one.
finish.
Just want to point out, we're talking about unions here, but France has probably the lowest percentage of union members in the working population, but they get enormous support from the public. And there's something to be said for that. So even if you're not connecting into a union, people should be aware of what they do, because they're the first to hold the government's toes to the fire if they're not living up to their duty. They're one of the first to expose the corruption and problems with capitalism, unregulated capitalism. And so, yeah, talk to everybody.